She cleaned the same kitchen every day, with the same apron stained with silence, and every morning in the same corner of the sink, he left a red rose. He said nothing. He just left it, as if he knew she needed something beautiful among the dirty dishes and the whispers of the house. She never dared to ask, and he never explained. It was a wordless pact, made of glances that met briefly before breakfast began. But that day, when the gate opened earlier than usual, the sound of his wife's heels echoed like a warning. The rose was still in the apron, and the silence, the one that protected, became a sentence. The woman who should never have existed in that triangle crossed the room with a scent of possession and eyes that saw everything. There was no scandal. There was no scream, just a discreet gesture, a long look at the rose, and a cold invitation to the maid. You can rest for today. In that sentence, there was something deeper than a dismissal. There was the warning, the goodbye, the nameless shame. And he, the man who always hid among flowers and silence, did not say a word. He did not defend her. He did not look at her. And in that moment she understood. Her love was invisible, but her pain would be remembered. Because silence also takes its toll, and what begins hidden sometimes ends in front of everyone. If this story has already caught your attention in the first few seconds, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It makes all the difference in helping more. People find stories like this. She always arrived before sunrise, when the mansion still breathed in silence and the hallways seemed suspended in time. The sound of the automatic gate was the first sound of the day, followed by the soft click of her footsteps on the cold marble. Each morning was a discreet repetition of gestures that no one noticed. The towel spread out, the cloth wrung out over the sink, the dishes cleaned without haste. She didn't rush. She didn't smile at anyone. She didn't leave a trace. And yet he always knew she was there. It was in the kitchen that it all began. On the apron hanging on the hook, a rose. Always fresh, always red, always placed before she arrived. There was never a note. There was never a word. Just the flower. And a light scent that she recognized. At first she thought it was a mistake. Then, coincidence. But when the rose appeared again every day, she understood. It was a message with no declared recipient. And even without admitting it, she waited for it every day. He never looked at her in front of others. But when they passed each other alone in the hallway, there was an extra second in their gaze. A pause. A silence filled with everything that could not be said. He was married. She was a maid. The difference between them was etched in every corner of the house. In the silverware she cleaned, in the travel photos she dusted, in his wife's expensive dresses she organized in the closet. But still, there was something between them. Something silent, forbidden, and growing. The employees commented, some with malice, others with envy. She pretended not to hear. She knew that nothing was really happening, that there had never been an unusual touch, an intimate conversation, a hidden encounter. But she also knew that feelings do not need to be confessed to exist. They grow in the unsaid, in the smallest gestures, in the avoided glances. They grow in the space that exists between two people who know they will never be. That morning, when she opened the kitchen door, she noticed something was different. The silence was not the same. The air seemed denser, and there on her apron was the rose, but more open, more fragrant, as if it was in a hurry to die. She picked it up delicately, as if she were holding a secret. She put it in her apron pocket and took a deep breath. She didn't know it yet, but that would be the last time she would touch that flower. Because destiny was already opening the gate, and this time, it wasn't her who was arriving. At first she barely knew his name. He was just the boss, the man with the slow walk and low voice, who rarely appeared in the common rooms of the house. She caught glimpses of him, sometimes walking up the stairs with his cell phone pressed to his ear, other times standing on the porch with his eyes lost in a spot beyond the garden. There was a quiet solitude about him, as if something was eating him up inside. But she never dared ask. Her job was to clean, organize, disappear, and she did it excellently. The first rose appeared on a Monday. It was lying on the floor of the laundry room, already a little damaged. She found it next to a silk handkerchief, as if it had slipped out of a pocket without anyone noticing. She cleaned it, put it in a glass of water and left it on the sink. The next morning another rose, but this time intact, carefully leaning against the clean dishcloth. She stopped, looked around, and felt her heart beat faster. Was it a coincidence? Was it some symbolic gesture? There was no way of knowing, but she accepted the mystery like someone accepting the rain, without resisting. The following days brought more roses, always discreet, always solitary. A gesture too small to be accused of anything, but big enough to be felt. She began to wait, to wake up earlier, to walk more slowly down the hallway, just to cross paths with him by chance. Sometimes they exchanged a curt, "Good morning," other times not even that. But when their eyes met, there was a pause in time, as if the world forgot to turn for a second. She dressed more carefully, even though she knew he probably wouldn't notice, but he did. His eyes weren't those of someone who was in a hurry to desire her. They were those of someone who was silently admiring her. There was respect in that silence, there was tenderness, and that confused her more than anything else. Because it was easy to defend yourself from an attack, it was hard to protect yourself from a silent affection. The moment that had the most impact on her was one rainy afternoon, when she was trapped at the back gate due to a system failure. He appeared, alone, holding an umbrella that was too big for both of them. He didn't say anything. He just opened the metal frame and stood next to her. They walked together to the kitchen door. Their shoulders touched lightly. When she entered, her clothes slightly damp, she noticed that the rose from that day was on the stove, as if he knew. She would need it more than ever. Little by little, the other employees began to notice. One of them commented that her boss seemed more distracted. A driver said he saw him looking out the window while she was sweeping the yard. Nothing scandalous, nothing verifiable, just murmurs. She felt the weight of each one of them, and yet she couldn't turn away, because somewhere in her heart she believed there was something pure there, something that asked for nothing more than presence, existence. And then he started to appear more in the kitchen. He would get his own coffee, ask about the weather, about the house dog that she always fed. They were brief conversations, but for her, they were entire chapters. Each word of his was like a comma in a story that she didn't know if she could write, and it was in that phase between coffee and silence that she began to truly love. Not with euphoria, but with care, like someone who takes care of something they can't touch. Her love had no name, no space, no promise. It was a presence that lived in the details, in the seconds he looked back before leaving, in the slow steps that seemed to wait for her in the hallway, in the way the rose was left with more and more delicacy. She knew it wasn't right. She knew it couldn't grow in someone else's soil, but even flowers that grow between cracks insist on blooming. And that's how she felt, a silent flower, growing among the shards of a story that wasn't hers. There were days when she forced herself to ignore it. She tried to look away, to respond coldly, to pretend she hadn't seen the rose, but her heart ached as if something had broken inside her, as if she were betraying a part of her that only stayed alive because she believed in something greater than reality. It was contradictory, it was insane, it was dangerous, but it was true, and she fed on it, on that silent truth that no one saw, that no one would understand. She spent her nights awake, whispering to God. She asked for strength. She asked for clarity. She asked not to love. But deep down she feared that one day the feeling would end. Because if it did, what would be left? What would her life be without that brief moment of enchantment in the midst of the routine of serving, cleaning and hiding? One night her mother noticed that she was quieter than usual. She tried to hide it, saying it was just tiredness, but her hands were shaking as she held the cup. Because that day, his gaze lasted longer, and she felt like crying. Not out of sadness, but because she didn't know where to keep that affection that no one could see. Because she couldn't tell anyone that, even without touching, even without saying it, she felt loved in a way she never imagined. even if it was just an illusion, even if it was just a beautiful invention of the mind of an invisible woman. The hardest part was dealing with the next day. When the rose appeared, she smiled inside. But when she saw the ring on his finger, everything hurt. Again, because he belonged to someone else, to an elegant, tall woman who owned everything, including him. And even though there was no touching, no vows, no confessions, she knew that the rose carried more than perfume. It carried intentions, and that was what killed her silently, knowing that even without having done anything, she was already guilty. On a muggy Thursday afternoon, she heard his voice closer than usual. He called her by her full name, and it sent shivers down her spine. She turned around slowly, trying to hide her emotion. He was standing in the doorway, his hands in his pockets and his eyes sadder than ever. "Do you like roses?" he asked. She wanted to say yes, that they saved her days, that they were why she kept going. But all she could say was, "I clean up what they leave me." He nodded. He smiled slightly and left. From that day on, besides the rose, there was also a short note. Loose sentences. "I thought of you today. I hope you're well. Your coffee is the best I've ever had." Little things. But she read them as if they were love letters. She kept them all, hidden in the lining of her bag, like someone who keeps their sins in a reliquary. She knew she was going too far, that path would only lead to pain. But how can you stop what you didn't choose? How can you bury a feeling that came out of nowhere and turned into everything? Her love was a low flame. It didn't burn, but it didn't go out either. And it was in this gentle fire that she lived, knowing that one day it could consume everything. There were nights when she cried in silence, staring at the ceiling of the simple room where she slept. It wasn't sadness that she felt, but a nameless anguish, an emptiness of someone who loves on the inside and keeps quiet on the outside. She was aware of the place she occupied, of the unspoken rules that surrounded relationships like theirs. And yet, she couldn't help but feel. She couldn't erase the heat in her chest every time. She found the rose delicately left in her apron. It was wrong and she knew it. But it wasn't dirty, it was pure, contained, forbidden, and for that very reason, so intense. The following mornings she cleaned the same cutlery, the same glasses, the same traces of the life he shared with another. And even without meaning to, she compared herself to that woman, his wife. Rich, imposing, cold. She entered and left the house with firm steps, greeted with a brief nod, and never looked anyone in the eye. It was as if everything was part of a scenario set up for her to exist effortlessly. The maid, on the other hand, knew what it meant to win someone's gaze. She began to notice the lack of sparkle in his eyes when he was with her. She noticed how he avoided touching her, how their gestures between them were too formal, too choreographed. There was affection, perhaps, but there was no life left. And that was where her love fed, in the fantasy that he could be closer to her than to his own wife. It was dangerous to think that way, but that was what got her through. One day when she was cleaning her office, she saw a wedding portrait on the desk. His face was smiling, but it wasn't the same smile he had now. It was a young smile, proud, but without depth. She touched the frame lightly and whispered, "Do you still smile like that?" Then she took her hand away, as if she had committed a sin. Shame was her constant companion. It followed her through the hallways, through the rooms, through the clothes she ironed, through the clothes he wore and which she recognized by their smell. She carried a burden that no one saw, because to the world she was just the maid. And any feeling that came from there was already wrong. Even if she had never crossed the line, even if love existed only in small gestures, even if she had never had the chance to choose. She began to avoid his eyes. She stopped answering his notes, not for lack of will, but out of desperation. If she gave another inch of her heart, she wouldn't be able to come back. And she needed to keep her feet on the ground. She needed to remain invisible. So she pretended that she didn't feel, that she didn't see, that she didn't expect anything anymore. But inside her, the flower was slowly withering. The lack of response changed his expression. His gaze grew weary. He took longer to appear in the kitchen, The note stopped, but the rose remained. The rose, stubborn, remained there, every day, and that broke her heart even more, because it was as if he were saying, even if you don't want me to, I'm still here, and as if he were also saying, I understand. At that point, she thought about quitting, but she didn't have the courage. She didn't want to leave the only story where, even as an extra, she still felt like she was part of something, so she stayed. She kept cleaning, organizing, serving, but now her eyes were filled with tears, because the silence between them was no longer enchantment. It was an unspoken farewell, and she knew something was coming. It was on an unusual afternoon when the house was emptier than usual that he called her by name, but not in the casual way he usually did. There was a weight in his voice, an urgency disguised by kindness. She was in the garden tending to the plants in the greenhouse when she saw him approach with hesitant steps. His impeccable suit contrasted with the vulnerability in his eyes. He was carrying no rose. There was no note, just him. And that in itself was too much. Can you walk with me? He said, pointing outside, where the freshly cut grass still carried the scent of morning. She nodded, a lump in her throat. They walked side by side through the trees, their shoulders never touching, their eyes never meeting for too long. He walked slowly, as if each step postponed something that needed to be said. She knew that this moment broke all the silent boundaries they had built up until that point. But she didn't have the strength to run away. They stopped near the hedge, the most hidden corner of the garden. He put his hands in his pockets, took a deep breath, and said, his voice almost whispering, "If I were another man, you would be another story in my life." She felt her skin burn. Her hands trembled. The answer came with just one look, a wet but firm look that said, "I know that too." He continued, still looking at the ground. "Sometimes I wonder where I got lost, where along the way I stopped living. And then I see you, and I remember what it was like to feel something." Those words were not a confession of love. They were a confession of absence, of longing for her own soul. And she understood. She understood that it was not about passion or desire. It was about being seen, about having peace in someone, about finding rest in the eyes of someone who demands nothing. "You never asked me for anything," he added. "You never charged me. You never looked at me like you wanted something. And maybe that's why it was the only sincere thing I had in the last few years." She wanted to say something, but her throat wouldn't let her. She just took a deep breath and stared at the sky, trying to find the strength not to cry. When she looked again, he was smiling sadly, and for the first time he came close enough for her to feel his warmth. He didn't touch her. He didn't make any gesture that could be mistaken for an advance. He just let the silence speak once more. A thick silence, loaded with everything that cannot be said out loud. "I just wanted to thank you," he said before walking away, "for existing here, for not leaving." And he left, without turning his face, without waiting for an answer. She stood there, motionless, with her heart exploding inside and her body completely still. She knew that that moment was a point of no return, that after those words, something in both of them had changed, that now, even if their love was not consummated, it already had a name, shape, and... Wait! When she came back inside, there was a new rose on her apron, but this time it was pinned with a gold pin, a symbolic gesture, a silent request to stay. And she understood. She would stay there, just as she always had, invisible to everyone's eyes, but present, deep within his soul. The following days were quieter than ever, but not that light silence of a calm routine. It was a tense silence, like the one before a storm. She began to feel his wife's eyes more often, even without saying anything, even while maintaining her impeccable composure. The woman seemed increasingly present, more attentive, as if she had awakened from an old sleep. Her steps around the house were firmer, faster, and she began to walk through spaces she had previously ignored, like the kitchen, the garden, the greenhouse, places where he and the maid exchanged glances. The rose disappeared for a brief time. It was 3 days of absence, 3 mornings in which she stared at the empty apron hook and had to restrain herself from letting her hands tremble. She felt her heart contract, as if something precious was being silently ripped away. That little flower, with its bright color and discreet aroma, was part of the soul of her days. Without it, the house seemed colder, more opaque. On the 4th day, the rose returned, but not as before. Instead of leaving it in his apron, he placed it on the sink, next to a small note that simply said, "I'm still here." She had to leave the kitchen for a moment to breathe. She went out into the garden, sat behind the greenhouse and allowed a tear to fall. It wasn't for the flower or the note. It was for what it meant. Even under pressure, even surrounded by suspicion, he still chose to leave a part of himself with her. From that day on, their encounters became rarer. He avoided the kitchen. He walked straight through the hallways. He only looked at her from afar, sometimes from the balcony, sometimes from the top of the stairs. But he always left something for her. A bookmark in the book she was reading in secret in the laundry room. A cup left on purpose with a note, "Don't wash this one. It smells like you." Gestures that no one would notice. But that to her were complete declarations. His wife, on the other hand, seemed to grow in presence. She spent more time at home organizing dinners, renovating rooms that had previously been ignored. She smiled at the guests, but her eyes always rested on the maid, as if measuring, comparing, evaluating, and in her gaze there was something of a challenge, of territory, of warning. One morning, she walked into the kitchen unannounced. The maid had her back turned, making coffee, and turned when she heard her heels clicking on the marble floor. The two stared at each other for a few seconds that seemed like hours. The wife then walked over to the apron hanging on the hook, looked at the rose that had just been placed there, and smiled. An empty, cutting smile. That said it all. Without shouting, without accusing, just with the elegance of someone who knows what they are about to do. "You've been giving yourself a lot lately," she said, her tone acid and polite. "He notices, you know. He notices people who give of themselves." And she left, leaving the sentence hanging in the air like a knife spinning in the wind. That night, she didn't sleep. She reread all the notes, smelled all the dried flowers she kept hidden, and wanted to run away. But she couldn't, because she loved. She loved not the rich man, not the boss, but that look that saw her like no one else, that silence where she existed. Even though for the rest of the world, she continued to be just the maid in the house. The next morning, she arrived early, and she saw on the counter a fresh rose, but next to it, a sealed envelope, with her name handwritten on it. She stood there for several long seconds in front of the envelope. Her hands were sweaty, her heart was racing, as if the mere presence of that white paper could change the course of everything. She carefully touched the edge, feeling that something definitive was about to happen. Around her, the kitchen remained silent, illuminated by a warm light that flooded in through the high windows. It was too early for the others to wake up, too late for her to turn back. She opened it slowly, almost fearing what she would find. Inside, a short note, like all the others. But the tone was different. In it, just one sentence: "If I asked you to leave now, would you hate me?" She reread it several times without understanding. Then she closed her eyes and felt the weight of those words fall like a cold rain on everything she had been trying to sustain. Was it a farewell? A warning? An apology in advance? The sound of the front door interrupted her thoughts. It wasn't her usual time. She hid the envelope in her pocket and went into the hallway. It was then that she saw her wife's silhouette crossing the room in high heels, carrying a suitcase on wheels behind her. She was wearing an elegant coat and sunglasses, even though it wasn't sunny outside. She didn't say anything. She just took a long look toward the kitchen and went upstairs. The atmosphere in the house changed. It was as if a storm had just passed through the walls. She went back to work, trying to pretend nothing was happening. But she couldn't. Her eyes kept returning to the rose, to the note, to his absence. Where was he? Why did she feel deep down that this was all the beginning of an end? He didn't have time to answer his own questions. Hours later, at the end of her shift, as she was collecting the cups from the living room, she heard her wife's voice for the first time that day, dry, sharp, firm. "You can rest for today." She turned around slowly. They were alone. Her boss was looking at her with a slight smile on her lips and a coldness in her eyes that left no room for doubt. It was more than a dismissal. It was a camouflaged order. It was the silence saying, "You've crossed the line." She nodded with a lump in her throat. She didn't argue. She just took off her apron, left the rose on the table, picked up her purse, and left. Each step down the hall seemed to sink the floor deeper. She wanted to look back, but she didn't have the courage. And what hurt the most was knowing that he didn't show up, that he didn't come down, that he didn't say anything. Outside, the sky was cloudy. The city went about its business, oblivious to her pain. She took her usual bus, sat by the window, and rested her head against the glass. She didn't cry. Not yet. Her body was too numb to allow it. All she felt was a huge emptiness, the kind that comes when something that was never yours is ripped away from you as if it had been. That night in her mother's simple bedroom, she slowly unpacked her bag, and among the notes she had kept, she placed the last one, still with his scent on it. She didn't know if it was a goodbye, but she felt that a part of her had remained in that kitchen, silent, alone. And even though she hadn't done anything wrong, she was being punished for loving in silence. She returned to her mother's house as if she were returning to the point where life left off. The rusty gate, the porch with the same smell of clean clothes, the kettle on the old stove. Everything was exactly the same, except for her. She felt like someone who had lived a dream too briefly and now had to learn to breathe in the real world again. In the first few days, no one said anything. Her mother just watched her with careful eyes, as if she recognized sadness without needing to name it. "You're thin," she said one morning, handing her a bowl of porridge. She smiled with the corner of her mouth, but didn't answer. Inside, her stomach ached, not from hunger, but from absence. She got another job, smaller, less demanding. A simple house, with a lonely, kind lady who treated her with respect and made her fresh coffee. But as light as the new environment was, she felt disconnected. The kitchen didn't have the same smell. The garden was small, without roses. The cutlery didn't shine the same way. And, in the silence of her new routine, she discovered how much the past still made noise. She began to dream about him, vague, fragmented dreams in which she saw only the rose, sometimes the apron hanging, other times his voice saying her name without urgency, as if calling for something that is his. She woke up with her heart racing and her pillow damp. One night she dreamed that she was returning to the big house. He was waiting for her in the kitchen, with his apron spread out on the counter and the rose on top. But when she approached, he disappeared, and she woke up alone. She tried to move on with her life. She bought used books, wrote letters she never sent, embroidered towels with flowers that reminded her of his. On Sundays, she helped her mother at church and lit candles. Without asking for anything, as if God knew what she still held inside her. But there was a loneliness that wouldn't go away. And sometimes she was angry at herself for having loved so much, for having allowed herself to wait for someone who never promised to stay. One grey afternoon, while walking through the city centre, she saw a man with his back to her at a flower stand. Her heart skipped a beat. It was him. The same suit, the same way of touching the petals before choosing. But when the man turned around, it was someone else. She smiled awkwardly and walked on. But at that moment she understood that she hadn't forgotten yet, that she still carried a part of him with her, and perhaps she always would. In the mansion, time had also changed. The furniture remained shiny, the lights were turned on at the same time, and dinners were still served punctually. But there was an absence in the air that not even the guests could name. The older employees felt it. The gardener whispered that his boss was different. The cook noticed that his favorite dishes were coming back full. The housekeeper said that he kept forgetting to order the coffee, which he always drank from the same cup before, the one she washed with the most care. After she left, no one found any more flowers in the apron, but one morning the gardener reported finding a withered rose lying near the kitchen door. He didn't dare say anything about it. He just threw it away carefully, as if he were throwing away a secret that didn't belong to him. And the next day a new rose appeared in the same place. He spent more time in the library. He read the same books over and over. He avoided his wife. He answered in monosyllables. When someone called, he asked to say he was away. One cloudy afternoon he sat in the garden and stayed there for hours, staring at the emptiness where he had once seen someone. The gardener came over to ask if everything was okay. He just shook his head. "There are people who come through here and never leave," he murmured, touching his chest. His wife, irritated by his silence, tried to get closer. She organized trips, lunches, and meetings with friends. He would go, but would come back quieter. At an important dinner, a guest commented that he seemed distant. "He's been like that since he fired that girl from the kitchen," she said, with a forced smile. Everyone laughed politely, but he just looked down. It was then that he fell ill. A mild attack, but enough to keep him from his routine. He spent days without leaving his room. His wife went away alone, saying she needed to breathe. The house was empty. Silence took over. The gardener, who visited him discreetly, received a request. "Leave a red rose on the kitchen sink. Every day, even if no one sees it." The man nodded without asking any questions. It was the first time his boss had asked him something so firmly. And so it was. Day after day the rose was placed. No one saw it. No one understood. But he knew. He knew that somehow she was still connected to that kitchen, and that if fate was kind, one day she would see that he had never stopped remembering, never stopped waiting. There were weeks without any news. The rose, however, kept appearing. The gardener followed the ritual exactly. He would place the flower in the sink at 6:30 in the morning and leave in silence. The empty kitchen seemed to be waiting for someone who never came. The new employees, who were unfamiliar with the old routine, found this gesture strange, but they didn't ask questions. They learned early on that in that house certain things couldn't be explained. They just respected each other. One day the housekeeper noticed that the flowers were brighter than usual. "Has he come back?" she asked the gardener. "No, but he left orders before he left." No one knew where he had gone. Some said he had gone to rest on the family farm. Others said he had traveled in silence, without even taking his wife with him. The truth was that the house was quieter than ever, and even though he was absent, he seemed more present than before. On the other side of the city, she was taking her life slowly. She still dreamed about him. She still remembered him. But she had learned not to wait. Until one ordinary morning, when she opened the small mailbox at her mother's house, she found a thick envelope with no return address. Inside, an invitation. White paper, gold letters, a familiar scent. It was the inauguration of a foundation, a new institution focused on women in situations of social invisibility. The name of the headquarters, the same as hers. It took her a few minutes to understand. She read it over and over again. She thought it was a coincidence, but on the back of the invitation, a single handwritten sentence confirmed it. "Some stories are not told out loud, but they are immortalized in other ways." Her heart sank. She felt her legs weaken. She sat on the doorframe with the envelope in her lap, her hands trembling, her eyes tearing up. It was him. It was the rose turned to stone. The silence turned into a monument. The next day she visited the foundation in secret. She didn't tell anyone. She arrived early, walked through the freshly painted hallways, saw photos of women being welcomed, heard stories told by volunteers. On one of the walls was a quote engraved in bronze: "You don't have to be seen to be felt." She pressed her fingers against the plaque and let the tears fall. It was as if every corner of the place was a piece of what she had experienced and what he had kept. When she asked if the founder would be present, the receptionist replied that he never showed up. He only financed, wrote letters, and sent flowers to the new beneficiaries. Red flowers, roses, always left discreetly on the beds, in the closets, in the gardens, as if he never forgot where that which became eternal came from. She returned home with the invitation clutched tightly to her chest. For days she could think of nothing else. She didn't tell anyone, not even her mother. She simply kept the envelope under her clothes drawer as if it were hiding a part of her past that was still burning. She began visiting the foundation once a week, always at different times, observing from afar, sitting on the garden bench where the red roses stood out among the others. She never asked anything. She just looked and felt. One autumn afternoon, he found a young woman sitting in the shade of a tree with an apron on her lap and tears in her eyes. The girl was shaking. She said she was tired, that no one saw her, that she was just another invisible person in the world. She sat down next to him and held his hand. "You are not alone. This place exists because someone saw all of us." And for the first time he understood the magnitude of what he had done. It was as if the love they could never live had been planted there, transformed into something greater, purer, more lasting. He had never sought her out. He had never called her. But every gesture of the foundation was a call. Every rose left was a reminder. You still live here, even far away. She stopped looking for signs. She began to accept what had been built, not for the two of them, but from them. One night her mother saw her smiling to herself as she folded sheets. "You look different," she said. She just nodded. Inside he felt lighter, as if he had finally found a place where his story was not shame, but a seed. He began to embroider for the foundation. She made a point of personally delivering the cloths and clothes that helped decorate the rooms. I felt that each stitch sewn was also a point of healing. One day, while organizing fabrics in one of the closets at the headquarters, she found a box. Inside were dozens of notes, anonymous letters, signed only with initials. Some were memories, others were apologies. At the bottom of the box was a different envelope. On it were just 3 words. "It's still you." Her heart stopped. She recognized the handwriting. She recognized the tone. She stood there for minutes, without moving, with bated breath. It was him. It was still him. I knew at that moment that I didn't need anything else, not their presence, not explanations, not reunions. Their love was not meant to be lived like others. It was meant to be felt between the lines of life, like a rose left in an apron, like a longing that blooms without warning. She continued going. To the foundation, even on the days when sadness tried to convince her to stay. Sometimes she helped organize the closets, other times she just walked through the hallways, touching the walls as if trying to feel his presence there. And she felt it, in a strange way, like an ancient breath that still lingered in the air, as if his footsteps had left marks that would not fade with time. One afternoon, when he was leaving the headquarters, he found an envelope with his name on it at the gate. There was no stamp, no return address, just his name written in the same handwriting that you would recognize even with your eyes closed. He opened it with trembling hands. Inside, a small, short, direct piece of paper. "You will always be the place where my soul rested." Nothing more. But that was all. It was confirmation that, despite the silence, despite the distance, the feeling remained intact, alive. That night, she dreamed of the mansion's kitchen. In the dream, the sun shone on the sink, illuminating an open, vibrant rose that seemed to pulse. She picked up her apron and slowly put it on. When she turned around, he was there, smiling. He didn't say anything. He just looked at her, like he always did. And then he disappeared, like he always did. She woke up with tears in her eyes, but with a calm chest. It was as if, finally, love had found its place. The following Sunday, she brought flowers to the foundation's garden. He planted 3 red rose seedlings in the most hidden corner, near the bench where he used to sit. She didn't tell anyone. She wanted them to grow alone, in silence, as everything between them had always been. And as she watered the soil, she felt she was watering herself too. Each drop was a memory, each future petal, a promise that love could bloom even out of sight. The women at the foundation began to call her the guardian of the roses. They didn't know why. They just felt that there was something about her that transmitted peace, strength, and gentleness at the same time. She smiled without explaining. She kept to herself the story that didn't need to be told. Because what we live with our hearts doesn't require an audience, it just needs to exist. One afternoon, while helping to tidy up the living room, she found an old black and white photo on one of the shelves. It was of him, still young, with his father in the fields. On the back was a handwritten phrase, "The strongest roots grow in silence." She placed her fingers on the paper and closed her eyes. It was as if everything from the beginning had been a seed, and now finally it was a flower. She returned home in peace. She no longer needed answers, nor meetings, nor letters, because love, when it is true, transforms. And she knew part of it would continue to live there, between the walls of the foundation, in the smiles of the women, and in the scent of the roses that no one knew who planted. Time passed. Years, perhaps. The calendar turned so many times that she no longer marked the dates. All she knew was that the seasons once again dressed the foundation's garden with new colors, and that the red roses, even when pruned, always returned. They grew discreetly, stubbornly, as if they knew how much they were expected, and she was still there. With her hair now grayer, her steps slower, but the same care in her hands. She was part of the place, and the place part of her. That winter morning, the wind was colder. She arrived early, as always. She opened the front door, put the kettle on, and went to the large living room to organize the papers that the women in need used to write anonymous letters. There was a new envelope on the table. Firm paper, sealed with an old seal. It had no name, nor a sender, but the symbol engraved on the seal was the same as the ring she had seen on his finger so many times. She sat down slowly, as if she felt she was about to open a final chapter. Inside was a long letter, in the same handwriting that had visited her dreams so many times. It was from him. It began with her name, her full name. And then the first line said, "If you're reading this, it's because I couldn't come back." Her body felt heavy. Her hands trembled, but she continued. He spoke of his life in silence, of the pain of not being able to seek her out, of the cowardice that kept him away. He said it wasn't fair, but that there had never been a single day when she wasn't present in his thoughts. He revealed that he had left his wife years before, that he had lived in seclusion, writing, planting, creating something that would honor her without hurting her. And the foundation, as she suspected, was that. An altar of redemption, a temple to what was never said. The letter ended with a request that she officially take over the management of the foundation, that she name the gardens after herself, and that, if she wanted, she could open the last box in the old closet in his office, where he kept things he had never had. The courage to give her photos of her working, dried flowers, tickets that had never been delivered, and, inside a yellowed envelope, a wedding ring, with her name engraved on the inside. She didn't cry, not at that moment. She took the ring, closed the box, and went down to the garden. The women from the foundation had already arrived. Some hugged her, others held her hands. Without saying anything, she went to the small greenhouse where the first roses she had planted were, and buried the box. There, next to the oldest roots, as if sealing something eternal, as if understanding that love, when true, doesn't need to be alive to continue blooming. That night, as she locked the house, she saw something stuck to the door. A flower, red, fresh. There was no one around, but she smiled, and she understood. He had left, yes, but what they had planted together would never be uprooted, because their love was made like this, without a stage, without an audience, without an end. Only a new beginning, in each rose, in each gesture, in each silence. In the corner of the screen, slowly, the words appear. If this story touched you, comment. I also believe in the love that no one sees. Like, subscribe, and watch the video that is appearing now. If this story touched your heart in any way, watch this video right now. It helps us continue to bring you stories like this, full of feeling and truth. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any stories that, like this one, speak of silent love, dignity, and hope. And if you believe in the love that no one sees, comment below. I also believe in the love that no one sees. Now, watch the video that is appearing on your screen. It will move you even more.